I would like to thank the University of Haifa and the International Relations Department, and specifically and especially Professor Benny Miller for extending this invitation and bringing me here to Haifa, where I've had a chance to meet scholars and students and get to see a little bit of your city, your university, and even a little bit of your country. So thank you very much for this opportunity, which is very special. So now that the microphone is on, I will stop saying nice things about Professor Miller, and we'll start giving you a preliminary analysis of the Obama administration's foreign policy. And I'm going to focus on the question of the degree to which we should expect major changes in the approach of the United States to its strategy. I want to look at some underlying fundamental sources of American foreign policy, and then much more briefly talk about actual policy choices. And the reason for looking at underlying factors are two. First, I'm a scholar of international relations. I'm not a person who follows the day-to-day foreign policy, and so I'm naturally drawn to look to underlying features of the international system. But also, and more importantly, it's very early goings. It's a very early stage in the new administration. We don't have a great deal of experience with which to measure these changes. And in a sense, we can view the arrival in Washington of the Obama team as a chance of testing various theories or ways we think about foreign policy, to what degree we should expect to see change or continuity. So what I want to do with my talk is discuss four issues, the first three of which might be regarded as fundamental, and the last item less fundamental or more derivative. I'm going to discuss first power, the distribution of power in the world, the power position of the United States. Secondly, interests, U.S. interests. How do American officials define what they want in international politics? Third, strategy, grand strategy. To what degree have American officials changed their grand strategic approach, their overall approach to how to achieve their interests given their power? And only after having covered those three issues, power, interest, and strategy, will I discuss policy, which will lead us into a discussion that I hope you will then join in about where we should expect this administration to go. So without further ado, let me start with the power position of the United States as it is perceived widely in the world, as it is perceived in Washington, and as I think it really is. All these things, by the way, are different. So it will take me a few minutes to discuss the power position of the United States. The perceptions around the world are all about American decline, the decline of the United States from its position of so-called unipolarity. And indeed, there is a global conversation about the reemergence of a multipolar international system. Now, let me remind those of you who haven't taken Professor Miller's Introduction to International Relations class recently, what is a multipolar system? A multipolar system is one in which there are three or more roughly evenly matched major powers. That is to say, major powers whose capabilities, military, economic, technological, are about in the same league as their great power peers. A system composed essentially of peer potential competitors. This conversation about the return of multipolarity is so pervasive that even the National Intelligence Council of the United States, as Professor Miller noted, I do occasionally consult with them, in their recent report called Global Trends 2025, the National Intelligence Council of the United States Central Intelligence Agency forecasts the relatively rapid return of a multipolar world. They don't say exactly when it's coming. They don't say that it's already here, but the conversation in that report, the expectation is all about the return of multipolarity. Stop for a minute and ask yourselves, where was this conversation only 7 or 8 years ago? Around the 2000, 2001. Back then, what everybody was talking about was American empire. In a way, unipolarity wasn't a strong enough term to describe the position that people thought the United States was in. So what changed between, say, 2001, 2002, and today? Well, we can name a couple of things. Iraq, Afghanistan, and most recently, global financial crisis. America seeming to be overstretched. The rise of China beginning to dominate people's expectations. A greater assertiveness, seemingly, by powers around the world. Greater willingness to stand up to the United States. Failure of some of the Bush administration's as stated policies and expectations. So a sense of powerlessness, or at least dramatically reduced capabilities. In my view, all of these perceptions, which I stress, are both abroad and even to some degree among observers in Washington, D.C., are overstated. They are exaggerated. There's no question that there are changes afoot in the global distribution of power. No question that China is growing rapidly, and that if China continues on this path for another couple of decades, it will indeed put itself in a potential position to be a peer competitor of the United States. Yet, if we look at the fundamental wellsprings of American power, they have not changed between 2002 and 2009 in a way that would warrant or justify this new conversation about a return to multipolarity. Namely, the U.S. still is about roughly 28 to 30% of the world economy in terms of its GDP. The United States remains technologically roughly as dominant as it was in 2000. The U.S. military is actually no less powerful now than it was in 2000. It's just that in 2000, people thought it could do anything. People thought in 2001 that we could do what no great power has been able to do in history, which is effortlessly defeat counterinsurgencies. In fact, we learned in Afghanistan, and we are learning in Iraq and Afghanistan, that guess what? Counterinsurgency is hard, and there is no magic technological fix. Yet the military capabilities of the United States, vis-a-vis, that is compared to other countries, has not declined between 2000 and 2008. China and Russia have not dramatically gained in military capability vis-a-vis the United States. In fact, if we were to take Chinese forces or Russian forces and ask them to do what the U.S. forces have been asked to do in Afghanistan and Iraq, I think you would discover that neither Beijing nor Moscow has any answer to the age-old question of how to defeat insurgencies. Thus, the events that have led to the new pessimism about U.S. power are not actually events that tell you about the relationship of power between the United States and other major powers. They're events that are telling you about the relationship between the United States and non-state actors, like insurgents and al-Qaeda. They are not telling us about the distribution of power among states. They are telling us about the distribution of power between governments and non-state actors. And therefore, all of the conclusions about the U.S. helplessness, the U.S. can't do what it wants, the U.S. can't defeat the Taliban, the U.S. can't defeat, all of those things apply to other countries as well. The last time I heard, even Israel had not come up with a magic technological solution to counterinsurgency. It turns out it remains hard, it remains bloody, it remains difficult. All powers face the same constraints, and yet the U.S. retains this dramatic overall edge in the amount of resources it has at its disposal. So power in international politics is relative. Most of the information that has led to the new pessimism about the U.S. is about basic absolute capabilities of the U.S., not the capabilities of the U.S. compared to other powers. Even the financial crisis, even the economic meltdown, which again has fed this sense of an emerging multipolarity, even that has affected other countries as hard or harder, generally, as hard or harder than the United States. Take, for example, a country that was once regarded, and is still regarded in some places, as an emerging pole in a multipolar system, Russia. Russia has been hit harder by this crisis, by far, than the United States itself. Its economy has dramatically changed course. Its foreign exchange reserves are sinking. Its market has collapsed. And it is overall in a much more difficult position than it was 2 years ago. Its relative position has been harmed more by the financial crisis than the U.S.'s position. This is true of many countries. It's not true of China, which continues to grow at around 6%. However, the gap in growth rates between Chinese growth and expected U.S. growth are about the same as they were before the financial crisis. So once again, the conversation about emerging multipolarity is forgetting the relative nature of power and the fact that power trends tend to change slowly over time. They don't suddenly change. Therefore, I conclude that the perceptions of power are not in sync with the underlying reality. The underlying reality remains unipolar, just as it was in 2002, and that underlying reality is going to affect U.S. foreign policy going forward. Indeed, I would even suggest, if you read closely the statements of top Obama administration officials, you'll see something interesting in there. In one hand, they are trying to downplay the U.S. role. They're trying to say, oh, that was the bad Bush administration that talked about the U.S. as the unipolar power. We are much more multilateral. We want to solve things as a team. But if you read between the lines or read more closely, they still see the U.S. as the leader of all these multilateral things that are going to happen. And that assumption of leadership is in fact based upon an assessment of underlying power or underlying importance of the United States in the world. I therefore think that the perceptions of power are over-perceiving decline. The Obama administration is over-perceiving it, but much less than the widespread perceptions. And the reality is actually continued unipolarity, and I expect perceptions and reality to come into line as we gather more experience in the years ahead. So the bottom line here on this first point, which is an important one, I've taken 10 minutes on it, the bottom line on this first point is that the underlying power distribution is not that changed between the Bush administration and the Obama administration, and therefore to the degree that U.S. policy is going to flow from the global distribution of power, we should expect continuity and not change. However, what countries do depend upon their interests, which brings me to the second portion of the talk. Obviously, if a country starts to have new interests, decide that it wants new things, the policy is going to change even if the power remains constant. So what are definitions of U.S. fundamental national interests? And again, it's very important to make a distinction. This is crucial for analysis, a distinction between the environment or setting of policy, the strategic setting, which I've described to you very simply as unipolar, the interests, and then the strategies for achieving the interests. Very often people confuse these various categories. We need, as analysts, we're sitting here at the top of the university, we need to keep these things distinct. So what are the core U.S. interests? The core U.S. interests remain security of the United States homeland from conventional and unconventional attack. They remain prosperity of the U.S. economy, that the United States can continue to be an extremely rich society on into the future. They remain the preservation of America's guaranteed constitutional freedoms, namely that the pursuit of security and prosperity must not come at the expense of the Constitution and the domestic freedoms that define the nature of the country. These, of course, are very broad interests. What do they actually mean? They mean, in the sense of the pursuit of security, an attempt to reduce potential conventional security challenges, but much more in recent years to prevent or reduce terrorist attacks on the U.S. homelands, on U.S. allies abroad. To, in the pursuit of prosperity in the near term, is to rescue the global economy from its economic crisis, to maintain market openness, to maintain access to oil. And in terms of domestic freedoms, the interest remains to achieve these things, as Bush used to put it, over there rather than over here. Namely, the U.S. wants to be the U.S. and not Israel. The U.S. does not want to be fighting for its freedom right next door to the U.S. The U.S. prefers to fight for its freedom 10, 15,000 miles away. Keep this stuff over there. Now, those interests have not changed between any post-Cold War administration. Indeed, any U.S. administration since 1945 has maintained these same basic goals. The issue is not the question of what the interests are. The issue is to what degree is the attainment of our interest is the pursuit of our interest, interdependent with the rest of the world? That is, to what degree is our security interdependent with the security of other countries? To put it differently, is our security dependent on a lot of other countries also being secure? Is our prosperity dependent upon other countries also being prosperous? Is our freedom dependent on other countries also being free? Or can we put a wall between these things and pursue our own security independent of other people's security, our prosperity independent of other people's prosperity, our freedom independent of other people's freedom? That is the fundamental question that Americans debate. They don't debate their interests. They debate how interdependent those interests are. And having said that we debate them, I should hasten to add, we actually don't debate them very much. There is really almost no serious debate over the issue that I just mentioned. That is to say, in Washington, D.C., in the policy-making establishment of the United States, the fundamental assumption is of deep interdependence between U.S. security and global security, between U.S. prosperity and global prosperity, and a little less the U.S. freedom dependent on global freedom, in the sense that it is not a requirement of the United States freedom that every other country in the world be free, but on balance, we're going to be freer if other people are freer. That is to say, the spread of democracy abroad helps the preservation of democracy at home, but it is not a necessary condition. So the fundamental point I want to make to you is that this transition of administrations from Bush to Obama has not changed the operative assumption that our interests are interdependent with the rest of the world, and therefore that our policy must follow to be quite engaged globally. That is, to preserve U.S. security, it is necessary for the United States to be deeply involved and care about the security of lots of other countries around the world. We need security of all or most of the major players so that they don't become insecure and do things which will make us insecure. Our allies' security, in some sense, is our security. Prosperity, too. The U.S. believes the prosperity of others is critical to the prosperity of the United States. The global economy must be revived in order to revive the U.S. economy. Moreover, the interdependence goes horizontally between security and prosperity. Namely, for the global economy to prosper, we must have global security. If there's too much insecurity in the world, this will break down globalization and the global economy. The result will be a threat to our interest in prosperity. Thus, we must keep the world as secure as we can. Particularly, the great centers of economic exchange must be kept secure. And the way to keep them secure is to have the U.S. involved in providing security to key players. Similarly, oil access is vital both for the world economy and for the U.S. Therefore, the U.S. must be deeply engaged in various regions of the world, including this one, in order to make sure that that continues. So the bottom line is I do not see a major change either in the definition of interests or in the definition of the nature of those interests, the degree to which those interests are intertwined with the global interests of other major players. So that then leaves us, having discussed the overall distribution of power, having discussed the fundamental assessment in Washington about interests, that leads us to strategy. Now, I should say before I move to strategy that having asserted that there's no real debate over the interdependence of interest, I need to insert a little caveat in that. Namely, there are some in the United States, particularly academic scholars like me, like my colleague, who do want to have this debate about the interdependence of interests. They believe there's a significant intellectual current in the United States that believes that our interests are not so interdependent, and therefore that we can pursue our security and prosperity somewhat more unilaterally, somewhat more independently from the rest of the world, and therefore that we can follow a different strategy. This group, however important it is in academic circles, that's probably John Mearsheimer calling, trying to say that we don't. It's Steve Walt. These are realists. They tend to be realist scholars, and they tend to favor a different grand strategy. So there is a debate about the interdependence of interest, but I want to say this. It is not a debate in Washington, D.C. It is not a debate among anyone of any influence over American foreign policy. The people who run American foreign policy do not care one whit what Stephen Wald or John Mearsheimer say on this question. There is no traction in Washington for the argument that somehow the U.S. can not care anymore about the prosperity of other countries, that we need not care about the security of other regions, that these things are completely independent, that we can have war in Asia and it won't matter to us, that so countries can go nuclear all around the world, we don't care. This is nowhere in Washington, and not only is it nowhere in Washington, it's nowhere in the politics of the United States. There is no major national party that has run on a platform representing this view. The last guy to run in a campaign on this view was, pardon? Well, it was Ross Perot, but more recently it was Patrick Buchanan, and in the recent election it was, oh my God, I'm forgetting his name, the isolationist guy. He, no, it wasn't. It was, Ron Paul. You've never heard of Ron Paul. Ron Paul was the standard bearer of this independence of interest viewpoint. In other words, it's nowhere in American politics. So that brings me to the third issue of strategy, which of course means, everything I've said so far means there's no real debate about strategy. Now, among academics, there is a debate, and that is essentially between two broad kinds of grand strategies of the United States. I have to look at my watch because I could spend too much time on this than it warrants. In fact, doesn't warrant much time in terms of predicting U.S. foreign policy, but it's very interesting intellectually. There is the strategy that follows from the interdependence of interest, that is primacy, the strategy of global engagement. This is the strategy the United States has followed since the end of the Cold War. It is a strategy that assumes the interdependence of interest. Therefore, the U.S. is going to have a very large military footprint all around the world. It's going to maintain security alliances with key allies in practically every region in the world. It is going to offer defense guarantees to key allies. The U.S. has some 87 defense commitments to various countries around the world that we are obligated in one form or another to come to the defense of these countries. We have informal commitments, such as the one we have, say, to Taiwan, which is a little bit less clear, a little bit more ambiguous, but that is potentially very, very important. We have a strategy that believes that deep security engagement is necessary for global economic prosperity. We have a strategy that believes that massive military engagement of various kinds is necessary to maintain open sea lanes, both for oil and goods of all kinds. We have a strategy that involves more or less open commitments around the world to an endless, deep engagement of the United States in various key issues, including, obviously, the issue of the Arab-Israeli standoff, but many, many others. The assumption is that all of these policies are necessitated by this interdependence of interest that I mentioned. The alternative grand strategy goes by the name of restraint or offshore balancing. That is a strategy that does not follow from or does not accept the proposition that all U.S. interests are so deeply intertwined with global interests. It believes the pursuit of U.S. security in many ways can be decoupled from the security of almost every U.S. ally, including Israel. The belief is that most of these countries are capable of securing themselves, and that if they fail to secure themselves, it won't really matter very much for the U.S. That is to say, if there's a war or whatever reason and Israel's wiped off the face of the planet, I'm putting it a little bit extreme, that the basic U.S. freedom and security and prosperity won't be affected very much. Obviously, we may have a normative desire for Israel to survive, but Israel's survival is not necessary for U.S. survival. But that goes for Europe, that goes for Asia, that goes for most U.S. allies. So the view is that the U.S. is capable of withdrawing its commitments, of pursuing a far more restrained foreign policy that involves not 87 commitments, but maybe 2 or 3 commitments. Most people who believe in a grand strategy of restraint do believe that access to oil is important, so we probably should do something about that. But all of that, in their view, can be achieved with an offshore military posture, namely a smaller footprint, which is the jargon for bases on land, and a much more significant offshore, or a maintained offshore presence can deter or affect most of the key outcomes that matter. That is a so-called restraint policy or offshore balancing. That strategy, as I've stressed repeatedly, depends on an assessment about the independence of interest that no one in power in Washington subscribes to. The result is no one in Washington takes seriously any notion of any movement of the United States in the direction of a restrained foreign policy. It is not on the radar. It is not happening. Nobody's talking about it. You can forget about it. The administration in Washington today, Obama's administration, is following and assumes that it will follow a very similar overall grand strategy. A grand strategy of global engagement, a grand strategy of maintaining all of these commitments, a grand strategy of maintaining U.S. military predominance, maintaining a unassailable military dominance vis-a-vis all other great powers, a grand strategy that assumes the maintenance of a very large naval presence around the world, very large military footprint, very large number of commitments, and a very large role for the U.S. in security of various key regions, including East Asia, Europe, Middle East. This strategy was in place already. There is no indication whatsoever of Obama administration moving away from that core strategy, and it's not surprising given their assessment of U.S. interest and U.S. power. Now, there are two areas where people think there have been, or I should say, I'm sorry, three areas where observers, and I'm going to move towards concluding quickly, but there are three areas where observers believe there may be big changes in terms of the strategy. First is multilateralism, second is democracy promotion, and third is so-called soft power idea. So let me just briefly tell you why all three of these things are not really very big changes in U.S. foreign policy. First is multilateralism. The U.S. is claimed is now, under Obama, a much greater commitment to multilateralism than under the Bush administration. This is a huge change. All the Democratic Party focuses on this. Obama himself makes a great deal of it, and indeed the rhetoric of the administration in its first months has been strongly redolent of this great commitment to multilateral enterprises. In reality, however, the U.S. was far more multilateral under the Bush administration than most people realize, and will probably be far less multilateral on the Obama administration than most people expect. Very briefly, I think that the Bush administration has been, by the way, I'm not a Republican, I'm not a big partisan, I'm actually one of these rare people. I'm a nonpartisan scholar. I really don't have a lot at stake in these debates between parties, which is very helpful, frankly, when you're a scholar. But the Bush administration, which I opposed on many things and thought were idiotic about many things, actually has got an unfair rap as regard to its commitment to multilateralism. The U.S. was extremely multilateral in its intent during the Iraq War. You are surprised? He brought the Iraq War resolution to the Security Council. This was a supreme act of multilateralism. Now, ultimately, of course, the Security Council refused to endorse a resolution that would authorize the invasion, but he tried, unlike Clinton with respect to Kosovo. Clinton did not even attempt to bring Kosovo to the Security Council. He simply brought it to NATO and went ahead and did it because he knew that it would be hard to do it in the Security Council. Bush, knowing it would be hard in the Security Council, was such a multilateral guy that he brought it to the Security Council out of his sheer commitment to international rules and norms. Of course, I'm being a little bit facetious, but the fact is that the U.S. always would prefer to have a UN Security Council resolution, and he tried it. The Bush administration was very multilateral regarding many key issues. Iran. In fact, many people wish it were less multilateral. We need to talk with the Europeans, with the Allies about sanctions. We need to talk with the Russians. North Korea and proliferation. The six-party talks was the mantra. Right? A Bush administration saying to China, you please take the lead on this. You're more affected in the region. We'll provide our good offices. I could offer you numerous examples of the Bush administration's commitment to multilateralism. Now, to be sure, the Bush administration's rhetoric in its first term did indeed discount in many ways the value to the U.S. of multilateral institutions. The U.S. did indeed talk about coalitions of the willing, assembling these coalitions on an ad hoc basis. And so there's no question about it that the first Bush administration wanted to shift the debate slightly in favor of the unilateral option. But the unilateral option is a constant in American foreign policy, not a variable. Every multilateral engagement the U.S. does, it's against the backdrop of, if you don't agree to our terms, we might go unilateral. And this is part of all U.S. foreign policy. Indeed, the classic example of a multilateral security episode was the first Bush administration's Gulf War against Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait, but remember, where George Bush Sr. said, "This shall not stand." He committed his government to the reversal of this invasion and then said, "We'll try to build a multilateral coalition." So every partner in that first Gulf War, including Mikhail Gorbachev, knew that if they didn't go along, the U.S. was going to do it anyway. And they calculated they'd be better off multilateral than in a multilateral coalition than letting the U.S. go alone. This is the unwritten clause in every single multilateral treaty the United States has ever signed. And this is true under Bush. It will remain true under Obama. The second issue is democracy promotion, where under the early Bush administration, it was seen to be made into a grand strategic principle of the United States. But again, here the story is, this was mainly a particularly, well, let me put it differently. The story here was that democracy promotion became part of the rationale for the invasion of Iraq. The belief that a creation of a democracy in Mesopotamia in the middle of the Middle East would potentially have a contagious effect, would embolden reformers throughout the Islamic world, would lead to this cascade of democracies. There were a few neoconservatives in the administration who actually kind of believed this a little bit. But that wasn't the main reason the United States went to war. It was an afterthought. It was one of the many mix of arguments. And when we try to piece out which argument was foremost in actually making as a which argument was necessary for this war to happen, the argument that was necessary for that war to happen was the one about WMD. If you didn't have that argument, there's no invasion of Iraq. The democracy promotion is part of the rhetoric, and indeed believed fervently by some officials, but not by many key officials, including Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney. So the democracy promotion at the military promotion of democracy, I think, was always a much smaller element in the Bush administration's grand strategy than many critics believed. And in any case, after Iraq, the salience of democracy promotion began to recede back to the more normal U.S. view, which is we favor democracy promotion. We would like to encourage elections. We think that elections are good. However, if important allies aren't democracies and we need them, then we're obviously not going to undermine our friends such as Mubarak in Cairo. So that policy was already back to the norm in the second Bush administration. And once again, in the Obama administration, I think you'll hear lots of similar rhetoric, but they will be pragmatists when it regards to democracy promotion on the ground. And very quickly and finally, the idea that there's a greater emphasis on soft power today. I think that is true. And in a way, I can use that as the segue or the transition to my last brief set of comments, because I know I'm now already over 35 minutes, or well into the talk. So let me now take the soft power element and fold it into what do we say about the initial policy approach, the initial policy initiatives of the Obama administration. In some ways, would you say that these policy moves contradict what I've said so far? What I've said so far is there's less change here than you think. There's more continuity than you think. So to what degree the policy changes actually contradict what I said? You might say that the greater emphasis on soft power, the rhetorical approach, represents a dramatic change. And it does represent a dramatic change. Obama clearly has a dramatically different view of how to communicate with the world, how to express American interests, how to seek to persuade his listeners, how to change minds about U.S. power. So in some sense, he is seizing an opportunity that he thinks he has by virtue of who he is and how he was elected, to use this as a tool for American foreign policy. And there's no question that Bush did not do this because he could not do it. He couldn't do it in part because he can't give a speech, as well as Barack Hussein Obama, and also, for much more importantly, because he is not Barack Hussein Obama. You have to be Barack Obama to use the strategy that Barack Obama is using. If you listen to his speeches, a part of every speech is, this is who I am. And the mere fact that I am me should make you rethink everything you thought about American foreign policy. Given that American foreign policy was in a difficult state with regard to its global popularity. This is a very sensible strategy. I would do the same thing if I were in his shoes. The question is whether this is truly a strategic departure from past U.S. policy. And the argument is, I would not expect that the answer to that question is the proof will be in the pudding. The proof will come when people raise the stakes in response. The proof will come when it doesn't work right away. And all of a sudden, it turns out that his listeners don't immediately change their specific policies in response to the speech. Then you will see the test. And my argument would be, when you see the test, you'll find out that actually soft power and hard power will retain roles in American foreign policy. The mix between the two will not change dramatically. In fact, don't forget, we're using a lot of hard power around the world all the time. We're using it in Afghanistan, we're using it in Iraq, and we're using it when we offer these various defense commitments that we maintain with powers all the way around the world. So, having dispensed with that issue, let me just make some final comments about the actual approach to policy of this administration, which I think is a fascinating experiment in how to run the foreign policy of a superpower. Their policy amounts to throwing every ball they have in the air. In other words, they are making new initiatives in absolutely every policy realm they confront. This is true in domestic politics, where they are revamping health care, revamping pensions, redoing the financial system, rescuing the economy from the financial collapse, and a whole host of other policies that you've never heard of. And they're doing it in international relations, where they're going to restart relations with key great powers. They're going to fix the global economy. They're going to have a new institutional architecture for the global economy. They're going to engage with Iran. They're going to deal with Korea. They're going to be heavily involved in the Middle East question. They're going to reinsert American diplomacy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the policy theory seems to be that if you get enough balls going in the air, some of them will fall where you want, and some of them will offer opportunities to pursue your interests, and others won't. And if they don't, so what? We've given it a try. Get a lot of things stirred up. There's a famous quote from Napoleon regarding his grand strategy, which was, we engage battle and then see what happens, see what opportunities arise. And that, in a sense, is the approach of this administration. However, I'm a little bit unfair, in that if you unpack any one area, you will see the outlines of a kind of a strategy. And let me just give you one very, very quick example. The Obama people do care a lot about proliferation of nuclear weapons. As I mentioned before, the core U.S. strategy has not changed. American strategy views the proliferation of nuclear weapons to countries like Iran really negatively. This is a very bad thing. Why? Because, as I stressed, they view the security of this region as interdependent with their own security, and they view this region as less secure if Iran has nuclear weapons. Even though these weapons can't reach the United States, they're a bad thing. So the U.S. has retained exactly the same view on this issue as the Bush administration and the Clinton administration before it. What did they do? They did actually have a strategy. Their strategy is, number one, is to fix the relationship with Russia, on the theory that Russia is going to be a key great power player on non-proliferation questions. So when Vice President Joe Biden said we need to press the restart button in relations with Russia, the main thing on their mind actually had to do with proliferation issues, on the theory that Russia could be diplomatically useful to the United States in its non-proliferation efforts. So what did they have to do with Russia is they offered Russia, essentially, potentially on the table with Russia are some concessions regarding Russia. Number one, we'll talk to them about nuclear arms. Nuclear arms control, which is what they want to talk about. We don't really want to talk about it. So by offering arms negotiations, we're making a concession. We're going to clearly soft pedal the expansion of NATO to Georgia and Ukraine. This was already, by the way, happening under Bush, so it's not much of a concession, but we're going to soft pedal the expansion of NATO, and we're going to show a willingness to negotiate about missile defense. Again, there are technological problems with the missile defense system. There are potentially superior alternatives. It may not be that costly to negotiate. In return, we want to have Russia's good offices on proliferation. And I'll conclude here. Again, I'm wrapping up. What do we want to do? And here's where I guess you will see a slightly different tinge from the Bush administration. Is they want to revamp the nuclear non-proliferation regime and make the non-proliferation regime stronger. They want to make it stronger by making it harder for countries to develop reprocessing capabilities. They want to make a global nuclear fuel bank to take away the ostensible argument of countries like Iran that we're doing this for civilian purposes. They want to set up a new regime. This is a sign of institutional revisionism that was not very typical of Bush, although they did do it in terms of many issues in the UN and counterterrorist financing. This is, to do it in non-proliferation is slightly different. But again, what you're seeing is an integrated strategy involving reaching out to a great power, making a speech about nuclear arms reduction, and seeking to build up pressure for revising the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which suggests a fairly sophisticated strategy about how they're going to proceed. They have similar strategies in different areas. To conclude, these strategies will not work as they are expected to work, for the simple reason that this is politics. That's the way it always is. When they are reversed, when things don't turn out the way they expect, when the ball does not drop where they think, then you will actually see the real test of my argument. You'll see the degree to which this administration is willing to A, go unilateral, and B, use hard power. If I'm right, that proclivity and willingness will be no weaker than it was under the George W. Bush administration, and you all will, years from now, say, you know, that speech by Wolhforth when he came to Haifa, he's really right. There really hasn't been as much change as I expect.